it leads us to the question of how has the church in her wisdom throughout 2,000 years dealt with chaos or with discord. It has been a part of our tradition, our way of doing business, that we operated under the conciliar mode. Why is that? The type of Christianity that St. Augustine of Canterbury was able to see was a conciliar mode of Christianity. Now, the other two modes are the magisterial and the confessional. There would not have been a magisterial mode of order in the church in the pre-Whitby era. That would not have existed. Now, let's look at what we mean by the magisterial. Magisterial, as you notice, just comes from magistre, teach, etc. And if you look at it carefully enough, you recognize that what it means is that there is, within the context of the teaching role of the church, a certain authority that comes. I don't want to get into the tired debate over, in the Roman Church, the matter of papal infallibility. I leave that for others with more time in their hands. But it is an innovation, and it is one of the innovations that has been difficult in terms of Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox dialogue. The great Metropolitan Callistos, sometimes known as Timothy Ware, is a wonderful Englishman, as you know, and like so many others, a former Anglican. But it's interesting to talk with him because Metropolitan Callistos says that it is the innovations in the Western Church that have inhibited the conversations between East and West. This is not even bringing any of us in. I'm just talking about the East and the West, the post-schism, post-Great Schism realities. That is, like any natural family, once there is a disruption in the family, the first generation is still talking about them and have already determined who they won't talk to. The second generation remembers all the stories that mom and dad told about it. Third generation kind of remembers it. At some point, there is a mentality that exists between the two factions, which is, you know, I don't know why we don't get along, I just know we're not supposed to get along. I just can't remember what it's all about. And then they sit down and they go back and try and look over the family history to figure it out. Some of the people say, well, now I know why we don't get along, and I want to reaffirm why we don't get along. And there are others who say, is there a way of revisiting that? Well, the problem is when you do grow in a particular way and then you want to get back together and sit down, you discover that some very natural things have taken place in an almost evolutionary fashion that make conversation somewhat difficult. The magisterial mode, it is said, is very good because it means that order is with a focal point. In the conciliar mode, it's sometimes difficult to be able to say where the focal point is. In the magisterial, one can say, I know where it sits, I know where it resides, and this church is so messed up, the only way we're going to straighten it out is if somebody will stand up, slam his fist down, and say, that's it. And there are families that want to function that way. If only Dad would just stand up and say something. Then there's the third. That's the modern method, because it's only, 400 years old probably at best, or 450 years old, and that's the confessional mode. That is a newer way of trying to bring order out of chaos. It's pretty impossible even to sit down with the Eastern Orthodox and discuss that mode because that's not even on the radar screen. But nonetheless, that's where various traditions have determined if they could pass something and they could go back and keep making reference to it, that is a demonstration of truth. Now, that is not to say that there is not truth in the confessional method. In fact, there's a great deal of truth in the confessional method, and in certain circumstances, it has been the way in which that has been looked at, and orders come. In fact, some would argue that there is a relationship between the confessional and the conciliar. There are others who would argue that that is not the case because while the conciliar is never dated, there is a dating reality that is a matter of relevance from time to time as it relates to certain confessional statements. Again, those of you much more knowledgeable in that area than I probably already thought that through, but it gives us something just for a moment to ponder. Is the confessional mode an appropriate way to bring order into the chaos of what has been called a postmodern phenomenon, a post-Christian era? Or is it a conciliar mode that goes back to some of the earliest realities rather than revisiting a number of things which occurred in a particular period of time? Or is it the magisterial, whereby we can say there's a focal point for this as it relates to bringing some semblance of order out of chaos? I just report the news, folks. I don't make it up. I don't have a fourth mode for you. That's what we do. Now, there are other ways of bringing order out of chaos, but those are the prevailing modes that have been used whenever we're sitting down and talking with people about a more classic understanding of ecclesiology. This, of course, assumes that we are dealing with a somewhat traditional framework. That is to say, this does not include the concept of congregationalism, by and large. This does not, by and large, include what I would call diocesanism. This does not include, as it were, a kind of nationalism. This assumes a more universal understanding of order, rather than just on the local scene. So therefore, for the average person in the pews, for the average priest who thinks of himself, or minister thinking of himself serving in a particular congregation, these modes may even appear to be irrelevant. Or as I was pondering one day after a meeting, which is the only thing I think I've given up overall in what is allegedly called my retirement, our meetings, or at least endless meetings. See, that's my vision of hell. My vision of hell is an endless meeting. And what happens is every time somebody is bold enough to put their hand up to make a motion to adjourn, the ground opens up, they're sucked down. But if I would report to you some of the things that I've heard at meetings, as you have heard, first of all, they're quite unbelievable, because those who say that Anglicanism has rejected the papacy obviously have not visited some of the leaders in some of our parishes. The papacy is alive and well. It's just a little dispersed. I mean, I was at a meeting one day where the folks are all sitting around in the bishop's committee having their meeting, and the matriarch was sitting over there. And every time it was time to take a vote, the members of the bishop committee were looking over there to see whether the matriarch was nodding yes or going no, so they would not vote. She wasn't eligible to be on the bishop's committee that year. She had to take a year off, but she never missed a meeting.